Namaskar. Welcome to Gnanis World. Dear viewers of Gnanis World, in this video we would be watching Brother Jerry Thomas' analysis on are Wright brothers wrong? Is aircraft mentioned in the Vedas is myth or fact? Before we continue, let's watch some video clips to know opinions about the mention of aircraft in Vedas.
Well, according to some, the plane was also made before the Wright brothers came. And they say it was made in the Vedic ages.
They're not very wrong. Conceptually it was made. Whether physically they're built or not, we don't have proof for that. Conceptually,
it's about imagination, to think that you can move from place A to place B.
No. You cannot conceptually…
राइट ब्रदर्स की ऐतिहासिक उड़ान से 8 साल पहले एक हिंदुस्तानी ने उड़ाया था प्लेन। $1500 फीट की ऊंचाई पर उड़ा था विमान। उस हिंदुस्तानी ने बढ़ाई थी देश की शान। 1895 में शिवकर तलपटे ने अपनी पत्नी के साथ विमान का डिजाइन तैयार किया था और फिर एक दिन हजारों लोगों के बीच तलपटे के विमान ने उड़ान भरी। सबसे दिलचस्प बात यह है कि आज से 120 साल पहले उस विमान को रिमोट कंट्रोल से उड़ाया गया था, यानी उस विमान में तलपटे खुद सवार नहीं थे। आप इसे आधुनिक इतिहास का पहला ड्रोन भी कह सकते हैं। तलपटे को यह विमान बनाने का आइडिया महर्षि भारद्वाज के विमान शास्त्र से आया था।
Maharishi Bharadwaj says, after studying those 6 sages and experimenting with the aeroplanes and giving a thought to it, I am. Mind you the word, he's saying, I am. He doesn't say writing, he says, I am telling you about the aeroplane.
But you cannot deny Indian mind has thought about things that nobody had thought about in those times. There is no question about that.
Hello friends, this is Jerry Thomas. Almost 60 years ago, there was a very interesting hypothesis. That hypothesis was there were ancient astronauts who helped in establishing the ancient civilizations. You could Google it and see books such as Chariots of the God, Technology of the Gods, The Incredible Science of the Ancients, and several other such books. The crux of this hypothesis was that the ancient civilization had access to a much more advanced science either through aliens or they have learned it from the aliens, and they even had the aeroplanes. Now these kind of books looked at cultures across the globe and then they proposed this hypothesis. But this hypothesis is now a discredited hypothesis in the academia. However, we are going to look at the topic, are there aircrafts in the Vedas? Now you must be wondering, if it is already a discredited hypothesis, why are we going to spend time on this? The reason is this: our central government, the BJP-led government, promotes the pseudoscience and claims that there was a much advanced science in the Vedic age. In fact, they have established a portal. The government of India has established a portal called Vedic Heritage Portal, you can see it, which the intent is the Vedas are the source of integral wisdom and science, not the word science. This is under the Ministry of Culture, under the central government, and this explicitly says the Vedas contain science. Now, if the claim was that the ancient Indian civilization, which had the Dravidian civilization, then the Aryan civilization, those civilizations had scientific knowledge to some extent, all of us would certainly agree. like every other ancient civilizations, whether it is the Chinese, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, even the Indian ancient civilization had its own scientific knowledge. Not in the sense of the modern science, but they know how to do some technological know-hows, they know certain things about the nature. If this was a claim of the central government, we would not have been spending time on this. However, this is not what the central government claims. If you go to the Vedic Heritage portal, under the tab Present Context, and if you come to the science, if you click on the science, and if you go to read through it, you will see they are making astonishing claims. Let me read one of the sentences. Most of the modern discoveries have been referred in the Vedas, and these are not mere literary concepts, but proofs are available for their existence. Most of the modern discoveries, look at the claim, are available in the Vedas, and there are proofs for their existence. Now, as I said, if the central government had claimed that the ancients knew many of the scientific, or they had their own scientific knowledge, we would have agreed. In fact, we will all agree that there are certain things of the ancients which are marvelous. For example, if you go to Egypt and see the pyramids, they are marvelous. However, the scientific knowledge that we have is incomparably superior to what the Egyptians had. As much as the pyramids are marvelous, our modern buildings are much more precise and much more magnificent. So if the Indian government was claiming in a similar way, we would not have disagreed. But as I said, they are claiming that the modern knowledge, most of the modern discoveries are mentioned in the Vedas. Now this calls for an examination. And our question is, can you give us an example? Of course, they have given some examples, and I am going to read and examine one of those examples. In the same website, Vedic Heritage, under the central government, it says spacecrafts are referred as PUSHPAKA Vimanas in the literature, and surprisingly, their mode of take exactly resembles the modern aircraft. So not only the Vedas have most of the discoveries, technological know-how of how to make a spacecraft is mentioned in the Vedic literature. Government is spending our money to propagate this kind of pseudoscience. So it is our responsibility as an Indian citizen and also as a Christian to examine and verify whether this is right or wrong. So let us do that. We will examine this claim under the 6 subsections. We will first examine one of the most known claims, that Pushpaka Vimana in the Valmiki Ramayana, whether that qualifies to be a modern technology. We will examine Swami Dayananda Saraswati's Vedic interpretation, where he had mentioned that these portions of the Vedas speaks about the aircrafts. We will examine those portions. Now these two, the Valmiki Ramayana and the Vedic interpretation of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, are not explicitly technological in their statement, but nevertheless we will examine. And then we will also examine SHIVKAR TALPADE and ARYA Samajist, who attempted to fly in 1895, which is almost 8 years before the Wright brothers, and many of our ministers, many of our channels claim that he should be called as the first man to fly, or first the one to invent an aeroplane. So we will examine that claim as well, because this is connected not just as an attempt of an Indian, it is also connected to the claim of the Vedic knowledge. And then we will examine the most popular of these claims, that is a Vaimanika Shasstra by Maharishi Bharadwaj, that there is a book written by or composed and taught orally by Maharishi Bharadwaj, which was committed into writing only in the last century. That is a different matter. We will examine it when we come to that. And then we will also examine SADHGURU'S claim that probably they did not have proofs, or we do not have proofs of the having say aeroplanes in the ancient times, but the concept was there, and the Indians definitely thought unlike any other ancient culture. We will examine it, and finally we will conclude by demonstrating the glory of the Holy Bible in contrast to the Hindu scriptures, even in matters such as this. So let us begin by examining the Pushpaka Vimana of Valmiki Ramayana. As I said, Pushpaka Vimana of Valmiki Ramayana is not at all a scientific achievement. It is just a mythology. Now our Hindu friends might object to it, but let us read the Valmiki Ramayana. Valmiki Ramayana, Arya Kanda, that is the third Kanda, Sarga 49, Sloga number 19. It says, it speaks about the chariot, the Pushpaka Vimana. There arrived the golden chariot of Ravana, elusive and wonderful, harnessed with donkeys and braying like donkeys. So this Pushpaka Vimana was drawn by donkeys, mysterious donkeys. Now you call that a scientific discovery? You can call that as an occultic power, or you can call it as a supernatural power, but definitely that is not scientific. Scientific has to be a natural one. That is how scientists, that is what we speak about when we speak about the scientific technological know-how. We are speaking about the natural causes. Now a flying donkey is not a scientific achievement. It is, as Valmiki himself, if Valmiki is the author or the composer of Valmiki Ramayana, the author himself says this is not a technological know-how, but this was achieved with the mysterious powers. Again, let us read Valmiki Ramayana, Sundara Kanda, that is the fifth Kanda, Sarga 8. Very clearly it says that this Pushpaka Vimana was manufactured, or to use the scientific term, manufactured, it was manufactured through spiritual efforts, designed through the concentration. The Pushpaka Vimana was designed by the dint of divine efforts and prose of Kubera. So it was a tapas, it was meditation, it was not a scientific know-how. So this rules out Pushpaka Vimana as a scientific advancement or a scientific achievement. In fact, if you continue to read Valmiki Ramayana, Sundara Kanda, that is a fifth Kanda, Sarga 8, Sloga number 6, it says, Pushpaka Vimana was borne by the multitude of Buddhas. This is a scene when Hanuman goes to Lanka and he sees the Pushpaka Vimana and he is describing about it. This was borne by the Buddhas. So driven by the driven by the donkeys, borne by the Buddhas, demons, Rakshasas, and then manufactured through the meditation and tapas. Definitely this doesn't come under the science at all. This can go under the occult, this can go under the fables, or this can go under even supernatural, but this cannot come under the science at all. This is not a scientific. So Pushpaka Vimana in Valmiki Ramayana or in any other epics, the other epics wherever it is similar things are mentioned, or whether Idihas, all of them are like this. So we don't need to look at it. We looked at the Pushpaka Vimana which is mentioned in the Valmiki Ramayana as an example. In this we see that it is not at all a scientific achievement. So now let us look at Swami Dayananda Saraswati's Vedic interpretation.
Now about the ancient aviation. The references of ancient aviations are in Rigveda. it is presented to you on the screen, the particular karika. In that I will draw your attention to a word, samudriya. It is very rightly described the atmosphere as samudriya. Even today's meteorology says that we are at the bottom of the loose molecules of gases which are like ocean above us.
We know one of the followers of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, Agnivir. So if you go to that Agnivir website, Agnivir is a website name, there is a specific article called Science in Vedas. Now this was written by Sanjeev Nivar. This guy claims to be an IIT guy, and he thinks that he is a very great intellectual. So he is writing about it, and he says science of building ships and airplanes. He is quoting from Swami Dayananda Saraswati. Swami Dayananda has detailed mantras regarding these in the Vedic commentary and introduction to Vedas. So in 1876, the scientist at IISc, that is the Indian Institute of Science, concluded that the mechanism of airplane as suggested by Dayananda is feasible. So not only Swami Dayananda commented upon it in his commentary, but scientists have validated that it is feasible. The first manned plane was built 20 years after the Swami Dayananda. So the first manned plane was built 20 years after Swami Dayananda. So look at the argument that he is bringing. See, he is saying that, see, this before Wright brothers, we give them the credit of flying the first manned flight successfully. So before them, 20 years before them, before they flew, Swami Dayananda was dead. So how could Swami Dayananda write about this if it is not there in the Vedas? So that seems to be the argument. And then it goes on to say these verses are very difficult to translate in English here, but readers are advised to review Introduction to Vedas by Swami Dayananda or interpretation of the following mantras, and he has given the mantras. So let us look at the one of the mantra that he has given. That is the Rig Veda, Mandala 1, hymn number 116, 3 to 5. So Swami Dayananda Saraswati goes with a very fanciful interpretation of the Vedas. And then he says there are three kinds of cars. The ship should be provided with the means of comfort. So he goes on to, you can read it in the screen, or you can read it in the website as well. This is available freely in the internet. And Swami Dayananda says such cars, so this is where the aircraft comes, such cars when moved properly yoked, when moved by the properly yoked Ashwins, so he is now interpreting Ashwins. Ashwins is fire, water or electricity and wind, bring success to undertakings. So there we are. Now this is Swami Dayananda Saraswati's commentary on Rig Veda. Let us take any other English or regional language Vedas translated by Hindus or translated by foreigners or anybody for that matter. Any accepted mainstream scholar who has translated this. So I am going to read, you can read it in your own languages. I am going to read it in my mother tongue, that is the Malayalam. Rig Veda, Mandala 1, hymn number 116, translated by Dr. R. Leela Devi. So R. Leela Devi says that this is chariots of Ashwins. Chariots of Ashwins, driven, as you would see later, driven by the horses. So this is the regular kind of chariots of what we read it in Valmiki Ramayana. These are similar chariots. So these kind of chariots are available were there in all the ancient cultures. That is how even the ancient astronaut hypothesis came into existence. Now if you would read it in say English, you can go and read it in Ralph T.H. Griffith translation. There also you would see These are actually, there is nothing about aircrafts mentioned. These are chariots of Ashwins. Now, what are the chariots of Ashwins? Again, we will look one more Rigvedic stance. That is the Rigveda, Mandala 1, hymn number 117. Earlier we read 116. So, Swami Dayananda Saraswati says, O leader of justice, O president of the assembly and commander of the army, please come to our abode with a car which has been well manufactured, which is swifter than the mind of a man, drawn by electric forces or horses. Oh, so Vedas used to mention about electric forces and all. Now let us read Ralph T.H. Griffith's translation about the same thing. Your chariots, O Ashwins, swifter than the mind, driven by good horses. So this is again horses driving flying chariots. So this, you can call this as a legend, you can call it as an occultic power, or you can call it as supernatural. Whichever perspective you want to call, you can call it. But this is not science. This is not the mechanical scientific advancement or technology that we are speaking about in Rigveda at all. Again, as I said, you can read it in your own the mother tongue, whichever that is. If I read it in Malayalam, again by Dr. Leela Devi translation, it says, Oh, hey Ashwinigale, Manovegathodu Kudiya Ashwayuktamaya Ningalude Redam. Ashwayuktamaya Ningalude Redam means chariots driven by horses. So this is not electric power, this is the horses. This is the horses that Rigveda completely speaks about. Otherwise, Swami Dayananda going to translate every other horses into electric power. No. Now the problem is, our central government is going to spend much time in discussing this kind of utterly nonsensical theories, which should not be discussed at all. The world has advanced much further. The world has advanced much further that now the world, for example, Airbus has unveiled plans to produce world's first zero-emission commercial planes to run on hydrogen by 2035. The world is speaking about that. World is progressing ahead, and we are looking backward at the Vedas, looking at the chariots driven by horses and thinking that they are aeroplanes. There is nothing for us to study there. So this is the problem. However, you might ask a question now, but this Agnivir has mentioned that this was validated by the Indian Institute of Science scientists, saying that what Swami Dayananda has proposed is feasible. Is that true? Of course not. Agnivir website hasn't given us the reference, but we know actually which was the paper that discussed about it. In fact, that is related to Vaimanika Shasstra of Maharshi Bhardwaj. In that context, they are saying H.S. Mugunda, S.M. Deshpande, H.R. Nagendra, A. Prabhu and S.P. Govindaraju, they published a paper titled as A Critical Study of the Work of Vaimanika Shastra. In that, they are referring to Swami Dayananda Saraswati's interpretation. And in this context, they are saying that Swami Dayananda Saraswati's statements appear to indicate in complete accord with the Newton's law of motion. Or other words, Swami Dayananda Saraswati has correctly given the Newton's law of motion. Now, Swami Dayananda Saraswati in 1880 is mentioning about Newton's law of motion is not a miracle. Almost 200 years have passed since Newton's law of motion had been given. So there is nothing miraculous in that. So what the Indian Institute of Scientists are saying is, when Swami Dayananda Saraswati got it right, how come a later book got it wrong? That is their argument. So this he has converted into saying that the Indian Institute of Scientists have said that Swami Dayananda Saraswati's models are feasible. That is nowhere mentioned. Otherwise, let him name the paper. He has never named it. He is speaking a lie. So to cover up one imaginary, fictitious, fanciful interpretation of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, his follower comes up with a lie. That is what it has happened. So we have seen, we have examined VALMIKI Ramayana's PUSHPAKA Vimana. We have examined Swami Dayananda Saraswati's Vedic commentary. At least two of those portions we have examined it. Now let us look a little more interesting one. This is the third section of our examining the Vedic aircrafts, and in this context, SHIVKAR Talpade, an Arya Samajist in Maharashtra, he attempted to fly in 1895. So which is a very good thing, which we should be all proud of. At least one Indian attempted to fly. But the argument goes that he learned it from the Vedas. You can hear a few clips of that.
1895 में शिवकर तलपटे ने अपनी पत्नी के साथ विमान का डिजाइन तैयार किया था और फिर एक दिन हजारों लोगों के बीच तलपटे के विमान ने उड़ान भरी। सबसे दिलचस्प बात यह है कि आज से 120 साल पहले उस विमान को रिमोट कंट्रोल से उड़ाया गया था, यानी उस विमान में तलपटे खुद सवार नहीं थे। आप इसे आधुनिक इतिहास का पहला ड्रोन भी कह सकते हैं। तलपटे को यह विमान बनाने का आइडिया महर्षि भारद्वाज के विमान शास्त्र से आया था, क्योंकि तलपटे संस्कृत के छात्र थे और बचपन से ही संस्कृत में लिखी गई विमान बनाने की ये तकनीक पढ़ रहे थे। सोनल सिंह के साथ ब्यूरो रिपोर्ट, जी मीडिया, मुंबई।
So that is an interesting thing, and the argument again goes that he was successful. Like for example, the BJP MP, the former Union Minister Satyapal Singh, he says that Wright brothers, who India invented the aircraft. So he says that before the Wright brothers, SHIVKAR Talpade, that he had invented the aircraft. So this is there in the NDTV. You can read it yourself. Further, there was even a film about SHIVKAR Talpade that you would have, you can see it in the screen about the poster of that this thing. So let us examine. So when we examine the aeronautical history, when we examine the history of the flights, we will know what kind of baseless propositions or arguments are being made by this Union Minister and the C News channel and all. In the history of the aeronautics, there are two types of flight. One is the lighter than air, that is the balloon, trying to fly by the balloon and all. And the other is the heavier than the air flights, which is the aircrafts that we are all using. So if you want a very brief history, just the points and all, you can actually go to the NASA website, go to the student section. You will actually see in one and a half page, you will see all the interesting milestones in both the lighter than air flights and the heavier than air flights history. You would be surprised to know that if you are not already aware of the aeronautics history, you would be surprised to know that actually the history runs into literally into not just hundreds of years, but even millenniums actually it runs to. So, however, I will be focusing on more on the heavier than air flights, because that is where our contention is, that is where our dispute is. We are not speaking about the balloons, because Chinese had done that much more earlier than anybody else. So we are not looking at that. We are looking at the mechanical ways of flying, and in this context, and specifically the heavier than the air flights, the history we are looking. So in this context, there are some interesting people. I will mention them about in very briefly. Catholic monk Elimer of Malmesbury, who was born in AD 980. He attempted to fly with the wings. He tried to make a mechanical way of flying. So he attempted, and he became lame after that. So William of Malmesbury, who is considered as one of the best historians of that time, and who had first-hand information to Elimer of Malmesbury, because they belong to the same order, had written about it. So this is a best attested incident of a human being trying to fly through some mechanical means, not just through a concentration of power, spiritual meditation and all, but this is one of the first attempts mentioned. And Roger Bacon, another Catholic monk. Roger Bacon is also known for promoting the scientific methodology. One of the earlier proponents of it. Francis Bacon comes later also. Roger Bacon, born in AD 1220, he had written about flying machines. So you see, actually this is not something very unique about the Indian context and all. He had written about, and this is there in the letter on secret works of art and nature and the invalidity of magic. chapter 4 on the wondrous artificial instruments. He says, and an instrument of flying can be made such that a man sits in the middle of it, turning some sort of device by which artificially constructed wings beat the air in the way a flying bird does. A remarkable statement considering the time at that time. So, but this is again a wishful thinking at that time, or a proposal at that time. However, we see by AD 1452, Leonardo da Vinci, he drew models, various flying models known as ornithoptera. So more like our helicopters. You can see those Leonardo da Vinci's pictures in the screen. However, these were not widely known during his lifetime, and no one attempted to build models then. But later, this was also taken into consideration. Now, there were several attempts in between. So, I am not speaking about the complete history of aeronautics history. I am speaking about the aviation's history, the major milestones or some significant milestones in the context of our discussion. So, Sir George Cayley, who was born in AD 1773 and died in 1857, he is known as the father of aerial navigation. So there is a reason for calling him as an father of aerial navigation, because he identified the problems of a heavier than flight. What are the problems that needs to be solved? How, or he at least identified the major problems, and he started proposing models at that time itself. So Charles Gibbs Smith writes about Sir George Cayley. The first aeronautical device Cayley made in the year 1796 was a copy of successful Linois and Binot models helicopters of 1784. And then he goes on to speaks about about the Cayley's achievements. Similarly, R.G. Grant, in the book The Flight, The Complete History of Aviation, chapter The Prehistory of the Flight, published by the Penguin Random House, says Cayley addressed to these problems of lift and drag through observation of bird flight, lift and drag, bird flight, systematic experimentation and mathematical calculation. So George Cayley proposed the scientific base of doing it. So here we see a real scientific attempt to do it. Again, at least 120 years before or 100 years before Wright brothers. So then see the power needs to be there too. By that time they all understood that unlike the Catholic monk who tried it in the 10th century, you need more power than the human power to run a flight. So they were looking for the power. So by 1840s, the steam engine had come, and the steam engine was successfully used in railroad construction, the steam trains transformed. So R.G. Grant, in the book The Flight, The Complete History of Aviation, chapter The Prehistory of Flight, he says, after these things, there was again a much enthusiasm and a desire to create a flight that human beings can use. So jumping in the bandwagon, in 1843, ambitious English inventor William Samuel Henson patented an aerial steam carriage. So there was a patenting already done in 1843. In the screen you can see the various models of aerial steam carriage drawn by Henson's model. You can see it this is in aerosocietyheritage.com. If you go there, you will see it, and you can see it in the screen itself. This is in 1843. By 1853, Sir George Cayley had a modest success. Modest success in the sense he created a model. He used his wagon driver to experiment it. It flew briefly before coming down uncomfortably. So it flew little bit, but the entire problem was not solved. It could not land properly. If you cannot land properly, then you cannot use that flight for the human beings. So you see, they were addressing various kinds of issues that everything has to be solved before you can call him as an inventor. Otherwise, it's a modest success. So again, unmanned flight. Wright brothers used the manned flight. Unmanned flight was successfully tried by John Stringfellow in 1848. 1848, they successfully conducted an indoor test flight of a steam-powered model. This is cited in Aviation History, page 24. And in 1874, again, a man-carrying airplane was finally built and ready to be tested in 1874 with a French sailor on board. It ran down a sloping ramp, briefly lifted into the air, and immediately came back down to the earth. So again, brief lifting is again done, but it could not stabilize, it could not control it, and it could not land properly. So there were other issues that needs to be solved. So you see, actually it is hundreds of years people are trying to solve all the problems. So several attempts were made in 1884 by Russian Alexander, then another Englishman in 1894, Frenchman in 1890. So you see actually the context of that time. It is in this context, SHIVKAR TALPADE, that we have to examine. He tried it in 1895. And in 1895, what he tried was not even a manned flight. It was an unmanned flight. As Ranjita Ganeshan writes, SHIVKAR TALPADE, the first man to fly an aircraft, says, Talpade's mission is said to have been an unmanned. And then the author goes on to say, besides the first recorded instance of an unmanned flying machine is of John Stringfellow, steam-driven one in 1848, which we examined from the Aviation History. 1848, it was already successfully tried, successfully done. So that is what around 50 years after SHIVKAR TALPADE does. You see, actually it is not a significant event in the history of aviation, though our Hindutva guys would like to hype it. It is an important event for the Indians that at least one Indian tried something. And again, Pratap Velkar, an architect turned historian who tracked SHIVKAR TALPADE's research papers, said that it was not even a successful attempt. It was just an attempt. It failed. In the sense, G.H. Bedakar, who has the SHIVKAR, the papers, the research papers, says that all the research papers shows that Talpade's efforts had failed. So first of all, it is an unmanned flight which was already successfully conducted 50 years before, and this is a failed attempt. In fact, the interesting thing is, SHIVKAR TALPADE, the Arya Samajist, continued to write. In fact, he himself propagated a book called Prachina Viman College Shodh. So he has been writing his own articles in Arya Dharma, he has written his own book. But in none of the, after this, in 1904 to 1908, he has written all these articles, then he has a book. In none of this, he has mentioned this attempt, because it was a failed attempt and there was nothing remarkable about it. But in 1952, one newspaper had a small snippet on it, almost after 55 years. And the editor of that the paper was Kesari, said that it is not a reliable news, because there is nothing to prove it. So all that we have is a 1952 newspaper clipping, of which the editor himself says that it is not reliable. But this was quoted in 1985 by D.K. Kajinal, who read Vimana in ancient India, and the flight was mentioned. And later it became that that first man to invent the aeroplane, the first man, it is our Indian, Wright brothers are wrong. So all those hangama goes on. For what? For an attempt, a modest attempt, which was a failed attempt. Now let us look at Wright brothers to settle this matter. What have they really achieved? If there were several attempts before them, what have they really achieved? Now, before we look at what Wright brothers really achieved, I thought of sharing an interesting thing from their life. In the book, The Complete History of Aviation, The Problem of Propulsion, published by the Britannica Educational Publishing in association with the Rosen Educational Services, we read that their interest, the Wright brothers' interest, started at the age when they were 7 and 11. When Oliver was 7 and Wilbur was 11 years old. Their father, who was a bishop, a church bishop, Milton Wright, gave them a toy helicopter. You see, actually they already had a toy helicopter and it really flew. At that time they had a helicopter that flew. So this was not the unmanned flight, at least a toy unmanned flight helicopter was flying at that time. And their mother, Susan K. Wright, was a good in mechanical teachings, and she encouraged both the bishop and his wife encouraged their children in the scientific endeavor. Now, what is their achievement? The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, they say that the Wright brothers solved all the problems that were together. Rest of them were trying to solve one problem at a time. Wright brothers were successful because they solved all the problems. They took all the problems together and they tried to solve all of them together. The Wright brothers followed Sir George Cayley's lead and initially reduced the obstacles to flight to 3 broad categories: a set of lifting surfaces, a method of balancing and controlling the aircraft, a means of propulsion. So they broadly divided it into 3 and they solved all those things. All those things together. So that was the success of Wright brothers. They not only could take off, they could stabilize, they could control, they could move at a distance, and they could safely land as well. So all the things that is required for a human being to fly, they actually identified the problems and solved it all together. So that was a success. Others were successful in flying, lifting up or flying to a brief distance, but then it came down without a control. So all those things are, all those problems the Wright brothers solved. That is the success of the Wright brothers. Now, when Wright brothers successfully flew, there were critics at that time because the French had their own man whom they claimed is the first man to fly. So at that time they said Wright brothers are not flyers but they are liars. So to silence these critics, Wright brothers went to France. And Wright brothers went to France and they Wilbur Wright went to France and he was going to demonstrate it publicly almost after 5-6 years after the first they drew the thing. So Wright brothers, in fact, he was going to drive a new type of flight altogether, and he was examining everything, and the public was getting impatient. In fact, the public wanted them to Wilbur Wright to fail because they wanted the Frenchman to be known as the first man to fly the flight. So this is okay. These claims are okay. But what happened is, after all these things, the Wright brother, Wilbur Wright said, "Guys, we are ready to fly," and then he flew. And after completing one circuit of the track, he brought the machine gently down in his skids. So the Frenchman saw that he was able to take off, he was able to control, he was able to go and come back and then gently land also. Once they saw it, they understood this is solved. The problem is solved. All our problems, now we can work on it, improve on it, but these guys have successfully solved all the problems together. That is why the Wright brothers are known as the people who invented the aeroplane, because they solved. Others were able to solve one of the problems or two of the problems, but these guys were able to solve all those things together. And it says, the complete history of the aviation, the book says, there was an uproar. So till then they wanted them to fail, but as soon as they saw it, they understood that this is remarkably different from whatever they have seen. There was an uproar, clapping and cheering, and the spectators ran forward to the mob the pilot. So they were so thrilled. Until then, their nationalistic feeling was holding them back. But when they saw with their eyes, everything changed. So no more claims. This is what we need. You can make claims, but when you have evidence, you need to accept it, acknowledge it, and appreciate it. But rather we are seeing it after 100 years, almost after 115 years, we still have people who claim no, Wright brothers are not the ones to fly.
In aeroplane, the people we lead, means transport from one place to another place, they sit behind me. Here, I am going to take you on a flight of ancient aviation, and all you passengers are sitting in front of me. So, let's start the ancient aviation. To start with, we'll go into the history of aviation. History is usually official history and unofficial history. I'll not go into the details of official and unofficial history, but only say one thing, that in the official history, it is noted, or rather it is only noted, that Wright brothers flew in 1904. That was the first flight of human being in this period. I said, only noted. I am not elaborating on this point. Antar sthiti cha khuna antarnishtha janati. Those who can read my mind, they will understand what I want to say. Now about the ancient aviation. The references of ancient aviations are in Rigveda.
That is because you are ignorant of the aviation history. You are ignorant actually why the Wright brothers are called as the inventors of aeroplane. You are ignorant about the entire history. That is why very briefly we have looked at it. In this context, there is nothing that SHIVKAR Talpade has done remarkable. He made a modest attempt. He failed in it. He himself never wrote about it. It was only in 1952 that was a snippet which was published in Kesari. The editor himself says which is not a very reliable one, and you are making a hue and cry about it, making a documentary on it, making a film on it. Probably SHIVKAR Talpade must be the most luckiest person to attempt to fly, because the others, many others who have attempted with much more success than SHIVKAR Talpade, none of them have probably a film in their name. But SHIVKAR Talpade, for the simple reason that he attempted, though failed, has a movie on his name. And we want everything to be connected to Vedas. Unfortunately, that story doesn't work at all. Now, let us come to the final piece of argument, that is a Vaimanika Shasstra. Vaimanika Shasstra by Maharshi Bharadwaj. Vaimanika Shasstra. This was even discussed in the 102 Indian Science Congress held in January 4, 2015. A controversial paper was presented by Captain Anand J. Bodas and Amiya Jadhav on the topic Ancient Indian Aviation Technology. You can hear a few clips of that.
Then my entire talk or my entire explanation is based on Maharishi Bharadwaj Vimana Samhita. It was known as actually Vimana Prakran, and Maharishi Bharadwaj, as it goes in our Indian culture, that very humbly he said that before me there were 6 sages, namely Narayan Muni, Shaunak Muni, Garga Muni, Vachaspati, Chakrayani and Dhundinath. These 6 sages had written, or rather compiled, I won't say written, Because mind you, in those days, books were not written, the subjects was narrated and learned by heart by the disciples. So that was, it was called compilation, grantha. So 6 granthas were written by 6 munis prior to Bharadwaj Rishi. They had written books on aviation. And next. Maharishi Bharadwaj says, after studying those 6 sages and experimenting with the aeroplanes and giving a thought to it, I am. Mind you the word. He's saying, I am. He doesn't say writing. He says, I am telling you about the aeroplane. And this is what is mentioned in Samhita, Vadati. That means Maharishi Bharadwaj was sitting in front of his students, or maybe he was standing in the workshop where the aircraft was manufactured and he was narrating the subject. And that's why in this manual, many places, Maharishi Bharadwaj says, pick that object from your right and keep it on the...
As you would hear the clips, you know that the claims that they are making. Now, this is already a discredited book, in the sense both from a scientific point of view and a historical point of view. The same paper that we discussed earlier, in the earlier section, H.S. Mugunda, S.M. Deshpande, H.R. Nagendra, A. Prabhu and S.P. Govindraju of the Indian Institute of Science, they published a paper, a critical study of the work of Vaimanika Shasstra. So they looked at the historical aspect. They said the manuscript from which the book was prepared is said to have been available in a Sanskrit library in Baroda in 1944. And it also stated that later another manuscript was found in Pune with a signature and date of 1919. So the earliest that you can go, even if you go by the signature date, it is 1919. And then they speak about the history. Sir, Sri G.V. Sharma, a close associate of Pandit Subbaraya Shastri, and Subbaraya Shastri is the one who spoke this and it was committed to writing. It appears that the Shastri, who was supposedly endowed with certain mystical powers, used to spell out slokas whenever he got inspiration. These used to be promptly taken down by Sri Sharma. Now this was committed to writing and this was kept unpublished for a long time. Later it was taken up and published almost in 1950s. So they say to date this, you can look at the language, Sanskrit language that is used, and they say it is a pretty modern Sanskrit that is used, though there is an attempt in the book. Actually there are certain few words did have structure similar to that of Vedic Sanskrit. So there is this is a modern Sanskrit, but in certain portions there is an attempt or there is an appearance of a Vedic structure as well. So we don't have manuscripts anyway before 1919, and we don't have a published work before 1950, and the language speaks mostly of modern Sanskrit, and there are certain portions which sound similar to Vedic, but anybody can write like that. So again, they say that none of the post-Vedic literature, the Vedic literature, none of them had ever mentioned about this book. So the absence of references, cross-references in other books. So before we speak about the translation, we should remember this. If it was written by Maharishi Bharadwaj, then Maharishi Bharadwaj is writing in modern Sanskrit. That is wonderful.
As actually Vimana Prakran and Maharishi Bharadwaj, as it goes in our Indian culture, that very humbly he said that before me there were 6 sages, namely Narayan Muni, Shaunak Muni, Garga Muni, Vachaspati, Chakrayani and Dhundinath. These 6 sages had written, or rather compiled, I won't say written, because mind you, in those days books were not written, the subjects was narrated and learned by heart by the disciples. So that was, it was called compilation, grantha. So 6 granthas were written by 6 munis prior to Bharadwaj Rishi. They had written books on aviation. And next. Maharishi Bharadwaj says, after studying those 6 sages and experimenting with the aeroplanes and giving a thought to it.
And not only that, initially the Hindi translation appeared and later an English translation appeared. In the English translation never referred to the Hindi translation, but in the English translation you started seeing pictures. So Maharishi Bharadwaj started drawing pictures for the English translation. Is that what we should understand? And now coming to the technological aspect. The Indian Institute of Science Scientists says that the principles of propulsion makes resist rather than assist in flying. They say the planes are described at the best poor conversions rather than expressions of something real. None of the planes has the properties or capabilities of being flown. The geometries are unimaginably horrendous from the point of view of flying. This is an atrocious design. These guys who have written this book, they do not know the principles of flying. Before we go further, you must hear the clip of Sadhguru, because Sadhguru says they knew the principles. Let us hear the clip of Sadhguru.
Get the license, because many of these rules were made before Wright brothers came.
Well, according to some, the plane was also made before the Wright brothers came. And they say it was made in the Vedic ages.
They're not very wrong. Conceptually it was made. Whether physically they're built or not, we don't have proof for that. Conceptually,
it's about imagination, to think that you can move from place A to place B.
No. You cannot conceptually imagine something entirely. Even if you imagine, you must be able to produce you must understand the principles in some way as to why something flies.
Yeah.
Indian mind has thought about things that nobody had thought about in those times. There is no question about that.
So, as you would have heard the clip of the Sadhguru, this is in total contradiction to what the scientist says. So, what the scientist says that these guys were ignorant of the principles.
So 6 granthas were written by 6 munis prior to Bharadwaj Rishi. They had written books on aviation. And next. Maharishi Bharadwaj says, after studying those 6 sages and experimenting with the aeroplanes and giving a thought to it, I am. Mind you the word, he is saying, I am. He doesn't say writing, he says, I am telling you about the aeroplane. And this is what is mentioned in Samhita, Vadati. That means Maharishi Bharadwaj was sitting in front of his students, or maybe he was standing in the workshop where the aircraft was manufactured and he was narrating the subject. And that's why in this manual, many places.
If you are going to make Maharishi the author of it, you will have to agree that Maharishi has to come to some good aeronautical engineering college, and he has to learn the basic principles of flying before he further improves upon this book. The Hindus are insulting themselves by fabricating books like this. Now, John Burrow here, who wrote the preface to Vaimanika Shasstra in 2005, he had a very interesting remark to make. He said it is as if someone in the early 20th century wrote a 100-page book on the ancient aircraft in biblical Hebrew and attributed it to Moses and other prophets. So there we are. That is what this Vaimanika Shasstra is all about. So we have examined the Pushpaka Vimana of Valmiki Ramayana, SWAMI Dayananda Saraswati'S Vedic interpretation, SHIVKAR Talpade's flying attempt, Vaimanika Shasstra book. In none of this you can see any successful scientific advancement. But let us finally look at one more of Sadhguru's argument that no ancient culture thought like the Indians. Let us hear that clip.
Not deny Indian mind has thought about things that nobody had thought about in those times. There is no question about that.
As you have heard the clip, it is not just Sadhguru who makes these claims. In fact, Dr. Patmagar Vishnuvartak, a medical doctor in Pune, who had established an organization also to promote the science in Vedas, he had written an article, Flying Machines from the Valmiki Ramayana, in the Journal of Oriental Institute, published in September 1998, and you can have it available, it's available in the net as well. And he makes the same argument. Scholars usually say that the aeroplanes in Valmiki Ramayana are imaginary. Here I pose a question that if Valmiki could imagine aeroplanes, why later writers of the world over did not imagine them? Very interesting. Very good question. But if you look at any ancient culture, such kinds of Valmiki Ramayana stories are there in every ancient culture. Just to give an example, pyramid text, Unas pyramid text, utterance number 267, he speaks about the Re. Re is an Egyptian god, the Egyptian god's ship or a boat that flows through the sky.
The references of ancient aviations are in Rigveda. It is presented to you on the screen, the particular karika. In that I will draw your attention to a word, samudriya. It is very rightly described, the atmosphere as samudriya. Even today's meteorology says that we are at the bottom of the loose molecules of gases which are like ocean above us. So the same
spaceship, we can call it a spaceship. If you are little imaginative like the Dayanada Saraswati, we can call it as a spaceship of Egyptians in pyramid text. Now you can see that in many things. In fact, if you go to Egypt in 1898, they discovered an artifact through the excavation of in a tomb in 1898, and that looks like a bird artifact, but it like a aircraft artifact. In fact, Dr. Kali Meshia, an Egyptian doctor, just like the doctor medical doctor of Pune, he is also a medical doctor. Dr. Khalid Meshia, he says, an Egyptian doctor, he says, no, this is an aircraft artifact. The ancient Egyptians had aircraft. And he goes on to list the differences between this bird artifact and the regular birds, and the similarities between this bird artifact and the aeroplanes. The other birds had legs, this had none. The other birds had painted feathers, this had none. The other birds had horizontal tail feathers like a real bird. Perhaps that was the most important thing. Birds don't have to be stable in flight because they can correct their direction. But a model aeroplane needs a vertical rudder to keep it moving straight. And this strange wooden model tapped into a vertical rudder. And not only that, this doctor's brother, a flight engineer, reproduced it in balsa wood and launched it, and it flew. So what else you want? They tried the model and that model flew. So now are we going to say that the ancient Egyptians had flight? Of course not. As I said at the beginning, these kind of stories from various cultures, whether it is supernatural or fables or whatever it is, all of them are clubbed together when initially that ancient astronaut hypothesis was proposed. But that ancient astronaut hypothesis is a completely discredited hypothesis now. Unfortunately, our central government is promoting the pseudoscience and is looking backward rather than to looking forward. Why are we doing it? The reason, there are 2-3 reasons for it, and I will just specify 2 reasons and conclude it. We will examine the reasons, God willing, in another episode. One of the reasons is the Hindus believe that the Vedas contain all the knowledge. In fact, Dayanada Saraswati's introduction to Vedas, he very clearly says that the Vedas contain all the knowledge. Now, if the Vedas contain all the knowledge, definitely it should have aviation or aeronautical engineering also in the Vedas. That is why the entire attempt to make that Vedas had this knowledge. It is a faith matter. It is a belief matter for them. Now, not only in contrast, the Bible, look at the Bible. We don't have to study Bible to study engineering. The Holy Bible itself says the nature and the scripture both are revelation of God. Psalms 19 says the heavens declare the glory of the God, the skies proclaim the hands of the works of the hands. So to study the nature is also to study the book of the God himself. That is, the nature itself is the book of the God. And the same Psalms goes in verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect. The Bible is also the revelation of God. Both the nature and the scripture are the revelation of God. So we don't need to get stuck like the Hindus saying that all the knowledge are there in the Vedas. We don't need to say that, because God has given both the scripture and nature for us to study, and that is how the entire modern science has begun. That we will look in detail in a later episode. Now, not only that, the entire Hindutva is built on a golden Vedic mythology. If you read Guru Golwakar's book Bunch of Thoughts, in part 2, The Nation and Its Problems, it says uniqueness of Hindu Rashtra. Hindustan lived a life of unchallenged glory and power of 1,000 years, power for 1,000 years, and spread its cultural and spiritual and cultural, so and so and so, he goes on and says. So this entire Hindutva is built on a mythical golden Vedic history, which never existed. So they are always backward looking. But we Christians are not like that. Our history starts in a Garden of Eden, and it ends in a city of God. We have a progressive history to it. We are looking forward to it. We are not looking backward to it. We have further progressed, and we will further progress to the city of God one day. And that is what in Hebrews 11:10 says, for he was looking forward to the city that has the foundation, whose designer and builder is God. What a glorious book that we have got. What a glorious guidance that we have it in the Bible. Bible never shackles us. Bible never actually chains us to the saying that all the wisdom is there. No, it doesn't. It says study both the nature and the scripture, because both are revelation of God, and look forward and not backward, because you started in a garden, but you will end up in the city of God. That is the great hope that the Holy Bible has given, and has distinguished itself and proven that it is the wonderful counselor for the entire humanity. May God bless us with the scripture and the Holy Spirit to move in the right direction, and we pray for this nation that it will come out of this darkness and into the divine light of the Holy Bible. May God bless you all.